The numbers have been far too high for many decades under successive governments.
Figures showed how the previous government crashed the asylum system in the run-up to the election. In their last 6 months in office, asylum decisions dropped by 75% and asylum interviews dropped by over 80%. So only a few hundred decisions were being taken a week instead of thousands. Caseworkers were deployed elsewhere and the backlog shot up. We've had to spend the summer repairing that damage, getting caseworkers back in place, restoring interviews and decisions, and substantially boosting returns. It will take time to deal with the added backlog and pressure on asylum accommodation that this collapse in decision-making caused. But the swift action we took over the summer has prevented thousands more people being placed in asylum hotels, saving hundreds of millions of pounds. So I'm also today publishing the full spending breakdown of the previous government's failed Rwanda partnership. In the 2 years the partnership was in place, just 4 volunteers were sent to Rwanda at a cost of £700 million. That included £290 million paid to the government in Kigali and almost £300 million in staff, IT and legal costs. The result of that massive commitment of time and money was 84,000 people crossed the channel from the day the deal was signed to the day it was scrapped. This so-called deterrent did not result in a single deportation or stop a single boat crossing the channel. For the British taxpayer, it was a grotesque waste of money. Since the election, we swiftly deployed many of the people who were working on fantasy planning for the Rwanda scheme into working onto actual flights instead for those who have no right to stay in the UK, helping to deliver nearly 10,000 returns since the election. Enforced returns are up by 19%. Voluntary returns are up by 14%. Illegal working visits are up approximately 34%, and arrests from those visits are up approximately 25%. And I can tell the House this new programme to tackle exploitation and ensure the rules are enforced will continue and accelerate next year. And then turning to border security. 6 years ago, less than 300 people arrived on dangerous small boats, but since then, an entire criminal industry has taken hold and grown, with routes stretching through France, Germany and beyond, from the Kurdistan region of Iraq to the money markets of Kabul. They profit from undermining border security and putting lives at risk, and it's a disgrace they've got away with it for so long. So since the election, we've established the new Border Security Command, announced £150 million over the next 18 months for new technology and intelligence and hundreds of specialist investigators, struck new anti-smuggling action plan agreements with the G7 and bilateral agreements with Italy, Germany, Serbia and Balkan states, and increased UK operations with Europol and the Calais Group. In recent weeks, international collaboration has led to high-profile arrests and shown the smuggling gangs we will not sanction any hiding place from law enforcement. And I can tell the House today we've gone further. With a major new international collaboration, the Iraqi government and Kurdistan regional government share our concerns about the people traffickers operating through their country who have helped transport thousands of people across Europe and across the Channel. But joint action to tackle those problems has previously been far too weak. That's why last week I visited Baghdad and Erbil to sign new cooperation agreements on border security, migration and organised crime. As part of that, we will invest £500,000 helping the Kurdistan region enhance its capabilities on biometrics and security, and training Iraqi border staff to tackle organised immigration crime, with new commitments too on joint operations, information sharing, pursuing prosecution disruptions and further work on returns. These are landmark agreements, the first in the world for this Iraqi government focused on playing its part in the world. Most people in Britain want to see strong border security and a properly controlled and managed migration and asylum system where the rules are respected and enforced. So we do our bit alongside other countries to help those who fled persecution, but where those with no right to be here are swiftly returned, and it is governments, not gangs, who decide who can enter our country. For 5 years, none of those things have happened, and people have understandably lost faith in the entire system. So we have the chance now to turn that round, to fix the chaos, to bring net migration down, to tackle the criminal gangs and prevent dangerous boat crossings, to restore order, control and fair rules properly enforced. Not through gimmicks, but through hard graft and serious international partnerships. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Speaker and you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for ensuring we had the proper time for considering the statement. Now, the Home Secretary seems to have a great deal to say about the last government and rather less to say about her own record since the election. But fortuitously, there was a large release of data last week which gives us an insight into the first 5 months of her time in office. And having looked at that, I can see why she is so silent on her own record. Let me start with small boats. It has been 150 days up to yesterday, since July the 4th, and in that time, a staggering 20,110 people have made the dangerous, illegal and unnecessary crossing. Over 20,000 since this government was elected. That is an 18% increase on the same 150 days last year, and it is a staggering 64% increase on the 150 days immediately prior to the election. Now, why is it that the numbers have gone up so much? Well, let's turn to what the National Crime Agency have said about this. They said last year, no amount of funding or action against people smugglers will end crossing on its own. They went on to say, and I quote, "You need an effective removals deterrence." Now, the Labour government, after it was elected, cancelled that deterrent. They cancelled that Rwanda deterrent before it had even started. The first flight was due to go off on the 24th of July this year, but they cancelled it. And had that flight taken off as planned, we would not have seen the 64% increase that we have seen since the election, exactly as the National Crime Agency foresaw. But it's not just me, it's not just the National Crime Agency. Even Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, has called for European member states to implement an offshore processing scheme, a proposal which 18 European member states are said to support. So my first question is this: will the Home Secretary support and agree with the National Crime Agency and do what Ursula von der Leyen has urged and re-establish the scheme? Because as a consequence of her failure to reduce small boat numbers, the use of asylum hotels, which they promised to end, has gone up by 6,066 in the 3 months following the election. And the asylum backlog, which she had a great deal to say about, has gone up by 11,000 in the 3 months following the general election, something she didn't find time to mention. Now, she did talk a bit about her deal in Iraq. Her deal spends £500,000 with the Iraqi government. Now, that is not a great deal of money. It's what you'd spend probably on a road surfacing scheme in our constituency. And the idea that spending £500,000 is going to stop people smuggling from Iraq, I'm afraid, is naive and fanciful. What might have helped smash the gangs is having life sentences for people smuggling. So perhaps the Home Secretary could explain why in the last Parliament she voted against the bill that contained life sentences for the people smuggling gangs that she says she wants to smash. Now let me turn to the question of legal migration. And there I agree with her. The numbers have been far too high for many decades under successive governments. Now, it is welcome that the numbers for the most recent year have come down by 20%, but that is not far enough, and we need to go further. I do welcome the fact they're going to maintain most of the measures introduced by the last government that has seen that 20% reduction. We have also seen the number of visas go down. Visas, of course, are a leading indicator of migration. Work visas down 28% year on year. Student dependents down 84%. Student visas down 19%. And care visas down 84%, all thanks to measures introduced by the last government. But I would like to know why this government has decided to suspend the planned increase in the dependent visa salary threshold up to £38,700. It was due to take effect in April of next year, but they have suspended it. If they're serious about reducing net migration, as she says, why have they suspended that measure announced by my right honourable friend, the member for Braintree, in December of last year? And if they're really serious about reducing net migration as we are, what we really need is a hard cap on the numbers proposed by the Leader of the Opposition and I last week. So will they follow our suggestion and introduce that hard cap? So, Madam Deputy Speaker, behind all the bluster and all the chat about previous governments, we see her record and her government's record, a 64% increase in small boat crossings since the same period before the election, 6,000 extra people in hotels, the asylum backlog up by 11,000, all since the 4th of July. We see the deterrent, the Rwanda deterrent, which the National Crime Agency and even Ursula von der Leyen says is necessary, cancelled by this government before it even started. So I call on her to think again on those issues, to introduce those measures in April that the previous government announced and introduce this hard cap. If she is serious about combating illegal migration and getting the net legal migration figures down, she will adopt those measures.
Secretary.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think if anyone believed that flights were going to go off to Rwanda this summer, the party opposite wouldn't have called the general election when they did. They would have hung on, hoping that it might happen. But it's just been the same thing time and again. They kept promising, they kept saying it was going to happen. But now everybody can see it was a total failure. It ran for over 2 years. And they kept promising the flights were going to go. They never did, but they just spent £700 million instead. They know so much, do they know, that this was a total failure. Their leader, their newly elected leader, won't even promise to reinstate it because she knows the whole thing was a con. And let me remind the Shadow Home Secretary too, the first half of this year, so the last 6 months of his government, crossings hit a record high for that season. If that trend had carried on, if that trend for the first half of the year for the record high had carried on through the summer, we would have had thousands more crossings that we would have been dealing with. Instead, because we had the increase for people arriving from Vietnam, this government introduced a major charter flight, return flight to Vietnam, and has been working with the Vietnamese government to make sure that those numbers from Vietnam can come down. We've also had to deal with a total collapse in their asylum decision-making that they left us with before the election, which has meant we have had to get caseworkers back in place that they had deployed elsewhere and let the backlog soar. But I would just say the Shadow Home Secretary then sort of wriggles a little bit around the net migration figures that have gone up to this record high, 900,000, because of the new rules that they brought in, that his government brought in 2021. Who was the Immigration Minister who brought in those rules? The Shadow Home Secretary.